Welcome to Chapter 2, The Founding and the Constitution. Before we get started, let's talk about what constitutions actually accomplish. The U.S. Constitution is one of the shortest and longest-lasting documents in the world. Many U.S. states have constitutions that are much longer. Some countries, such as Great Britain, do not even have a written constitution, but they have a shared understanding of what is and what is not constitutional. Constitutions are necessary to set the guidelines and design the institutions that form the government. Constitutions set up institutions. They establish rules for making statutory laws and regulations. They are the skeleton that provides structure to the political system, with the backbone being the institutions of the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Constitutions are similar to a car owner's manual or bylaws for a fraternity or sorority. They set the guidelines and design the institutions that form the government. There is tremendous variation across the world's democracies. All democracies possess some form of an executive, a legislature, and a judiciary, but the amount of power that each branch has varies. Note that in some systems, no one branch has very much power. In the United States, that is because the system of checks and balances among the branches saves us from that. In Israel and the United Kingdom, which lack written constitutions, have branches with even less power than in the United States. Many of the political disagreements in our country stem from our Constitution, what it says, what it doesn't say, and the various interpretations of its meaning over time. Let's talk about how it came to be. In this chapter, we will discuss how rules may limit liberty, but we will also have a chance to think about how rules also prevent chaos. Throughout the semester, we will discuss how a functional government protects liberty while preventing chaos, but this balance can be hard to achieve. In the early days of the Republic, we will see how political disputes over how to write the rules for a functional government were commonplace. It's important to know the timeline of what we were talking about in this chapter, so I've included this timeline graphic that you can use as a reference. Here's a quick history review. The Revolutionary War began in 1775 and went on until 1781. The Declaration of Independence was written in 1776. It was written by Thomas Jefferson. Keep in mind that Thomas Jefferson did not write any of the Constitution. This comes as a surprise to many people. In 1781, we had the Articles of Confederation, and in 1787, we had the Second Constitutional Convention. In 1788, the Constitution was ratified, and in 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified. The founders created a government based on a variety of influences. These included British legal and political traditions, colonial experience, and new ideas on government. While America's leaders were primarily practical politicians, they did read philosophy and were influenced by the important thinkers of their day, Hobbes, Locke, and Montesquieu. Thomas Hobbes believed there is a social contract between the government and the governed that provides security in exchange for liberty. Locke advanced the ideas of limited government and consent of the governed. He felt that persons' lives, liberty, and property required protection. Thomas Jefferson put Locke's ideas right into the Declaration of Independence. Montesquieu was a French political thinker. Hobbes and Locke were British. Montesquieu advocated the idea that power needed to be power to fight against tyranny. He believed the best way to do this was through the separation of governing powers. American settlers were self-reliant risk-takers who valued liberty and opportunity. As the British Parliament turned to the colonies to help shoulder the expense of the French and Indian War, their actions were widely regarded as impositions on liberty. And during the first half of the 1700s, Britain ruled its American colonies with a light hand. But by the 1760s, American colonists were increasingly resistant to the taxes and other rules imposed by the British government. It is interesting to note that despite the resentment toward British rule, some of the institutions of colonial government were later adopted by the states in the U.S. Constitution. Keep in mind as you review this chapter, in the wake of British rule, Americans were distrustful of centralized government, and the individual colonies had trouble coordinating with each other because they did not trust each other. They also had no experience regulating commerce, no independent military, and little experience with foreign relations. Like most governments of the period, the British regime had limited ways to collect revenue. In the mid-18th century, governments relied mainly on tariffs, duties, and other taxes on commerce. It was to such taxes, including the Stamp Act, that the British decided to use to generate revenue during the 1760s. Both the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act most heavily affected the New England merchants and the Southern planters, who united under the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," to oppose these new taxes. Fun fact, the standard Washington, D.C. license plate design features some version of this slogan, because the people who reside in Washington, D.C. must pay federal income tax, and they are not duly represented in Congress. Both the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act helped to unify Americans in the struggle against British tax measures. The merchants and planters defied their royal allies and actually joined forces with their former adversaries, the shopkeepers, the laborers, the artisans, and the small farmers. Working together, they organized boycotts and demonstrations that forced the Crown to rescind most of these hated new taxes. It's important to note that the merchants and planters were anxious to end the unrest, but the other groups continued to agitate for change. The Boston Tea Party was a very decisive event that helped to keep the colonists radicalized. So keep in mind the political strife in the colonies was the background for the events of 1773 to 1774. The colonists, let's start with this. In 1773, the British government granted the East India Company a monopoly on imported tea. The colonists, led by Samuel Adams, responded in protest. They boarded 3 British ships and threw the tea into the Boston harbor. The Boston Tea Party succeeded in provoking British government to enact harsh reprisals. The Boston Tea Party set in motion a chain of events that led to the First Continental Congress, making it a very decisive and important moment in American history. An assembly of delegates from all parts of the colonies called for a total boycott of British goods, and they began to consider the possibility of independence from British rule. The eventual result was the Declaration of Independence. The purpose of the Declaration of Independence was to explain to the world why the colonists had rebelled against the British and why they sought self-government. The draft committee included Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, John Adams of Massachusetts, and Robert Livingston of New York. Notice that the only southern state represented here was Virginia with Thomas Jefferson. And every year, Americans celebrate the signing of the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July. Written by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence is first and foremost a political document making the colonists break from England. Plus, it had to convince the other colonists and the rest of the world that Americans were doing the right thing. It is considered to be an extraordinary philosophical and political document. Philosophically, it asserts that certain rights, the declaration of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, could not be taken away by the government. Politically, it was remarkable because it focused on grievances and hopes that the founders wanted to use to unify a very diverse colonial population that was divided economically. There are 3 main parts of the Declaration of Independence: the argument for rebellion, the justification for rebellion, and the Declaration of Freedom from Britain. It was the publication of a pamphlet called Common Sense by Thomas Paine that helped to persuade many Americans to support the revolutionary cause. It was published in 1776 and was a strong defense of American independence of England. Thomas Paine's message sought out the heart of what was politically, ethically, morally, and practically wrong with English control of the American colonies. Our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution are famous all over the world because of their influence promoting the specific philosophies of government. Other countries actually use them as a guide. Thomas Jefferson includes Locke in the Declaration of Independence, but he actually revises a little bit about what Locke said. He changes the idea to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The government's purpose is the protection of the natural rights of man, and people have the right to overthrow governments that fail to protect their liberties. After declaring independence, the Continental Congress adopted the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation represented the first American attempt at self-governance. They created a confederation, or governing system, created out of a set of component states, where the national government is the creation of the states and subservient to them. The states retained their respective sovereignty. The Articles were the first governing document adopted after the Revolutionary War, and actually set up our rule book after we won the Revolutionary War. Individual colonies had trouble coordinating with each other as they did not trust each other, and the states could not be compelled to pay their fair share of war debts under the Articles. There was also the lack of common currency, which caused coordination problems with trade among the states. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government had few powers and limited ability to carry them out. It was unable to provide economic and political stability that the founders wanted. The Articles of Confederation reflects a fear of strong government. It has no executive and no judicial branch. Each state retained full sovereignty, like I said. Unanimous consent rule caused more problems. Each state could veto major changes, which made it very difficult to reach agreement when competing interests were at stake. The Articles of Confederation were actually the United States' first constitution. However, the institutions created through the Articles were not strong enough to solve the problems or run a new country. Congress controlled the armed forces, but they had no power to draft soldiers, or they had no power to tax citizens to pay for the military. The Articles of Confederation created more of a cooperative framework among the sovereign states, rather than a sovereign national government with the power to govern effectively. It's important to consider the rationale behind designing such a weak government. Like I said, the colonists distrusted the strong central government, and they just rebelled against such a system. And they wanted government literally close to home. The distance between the colonists and the British posed considerable strain on representation. They were likely to be more trusting of a state government whose representatives were more familiar with them and who were accountable to their particular state. And the states did not want to concede their new and emerging economic and political power to the central government. None of the states wanted to have any less power. So, as you know, the Articles of Confederation didn't work. Limitations on the Articles led colonial leaders to call for a constitutional convention. They felt their wealth was at great risk. In short, there was a realization that the United States needed a different government in order for the country and their financial interests to endure. Some of the concerns focused on foreign affairs because under the Articles, the national government was unable to enforce treaties. A new treaty with the British needed to cover all 13 states separately, and that was not conducive to promoting a sense of national government in the colonies. In economic matters, currency inflation hurt business, and land redistribution policies angered property owners. It was not immediately clear exactly how the new government would be designed, but the colonial leaders knew that the current state of affairs was insufficient for long-term prospects. The convention was a meeting to negotiate the terms of what the new government would be, what it would do, who it would represent, and how representatives would be selected, and other fundamental elements of governing. You might note that 16 of the 55 convention delegates actually chose not to sign the Constitution because they feared the new government would cater to the wealthy. Just keep that in mind as we get a little further down the road here. The failures of the Articles of Confederation, which led to the 1787 Constitutional Convention. Now, keep in mind this was called to amend the Articles, originally called to amend the Articles, but as we all know, the founders ended up discarding them and writing a whole new Constitution. One of the things that actually called for the revision of the Articles of Confederation was the Shays Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion happened in the winter of 1787 when Daniel Shays, a former army captain, led a mob of farmers in a rebellion against the government of Massachusetts. They were upset because Massachusetts had levied heavy taxes against them. Now, the state had asked for help from Congress in the form of troops to fight against this militia, but Congress, under the Articles, was unable to act in a timely fashion. This event showed just one more reason for the need for a stronger federal government. The Constitutional Convention was somewhat controversial. Rhode Island did not even send delegates, and some other delegates left early. Opponents of a strong government feared that a stronger government would be the result of the convention. The Constitutional Convention had issues of political strife, international embarrassment, national weakness, and the recent local Shays Rebellion to contend with. During the constitutional debates, you had Antifederalists who argued that only local democracy could approach true democracy, and they wanted to revamp the Articles. And then you had the Federalists who were arguing for a stronger national government, and they wanted to start over with a new constitution. Both groups did agree on the need to protect the U.S. against tyranny. And it didn't take much time to realize that the Articles needed to be abandoned, and they were there to create a new system of government. This new idea was based upon the idea of federalism. They wanted a government that would promote commerce, protect property, and uphold the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. Madison drafted the Virginia Plan, which was presented by Edmund Randolph on the first day of the convention. A key question at the Constitutional Convention was which rights should prevail, those of the states or those of the federal government. Keep in mind that any institutional design has distributional consequences, and it was very important to the delegates in attendance that the interests of each of their individual states be represented. At the time of the convention, Virginia was the largest state in the country, so it's not a surprise that they wanted a legislative branch apportioned by population. They proposed setting up a strong legislature apportioned by population. They wanted a bicameral legislature, with the upper chamber being elected by the lower chamber. This plan advantaged the large states at the expense of the small states. The small state response was the New Jersey Plan. The New Jersey Plan was not as well thought out as the Virginia Plan because it was produced in a rapid fashion in response to the Virginia Plan. The New Jersey Plan called for equal representation in the national legislature regardless of population. This issue of representation threatened to doom the entire proceedings. The outcome of the debate over representation led to the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise created a bicameral legislature. In the House, the representatives are apportioned by the population in the state, and in the Senate, there's equal representation for all the states, regardless of population. That made sure that Rhode Island had 2 members in the Senate, the same as Virginia, even though Virginia was much larger. The equal state representation in the Senate preserved the small state power, and to this day it still allows them to get a disproportionate share of federal benefits. But it was the only compromise that kept the convention moving forward. Now, keep in mind that in a bicameral legislature, there are 2 chambers, and both of them must approve legislation before it can become law. As the book states, many of the conflicts that emerged during the Constitutional Convention were direct reflections of the fundamental differences between the slave and non-slave states, differences that pitted the Southern planters against the New England merchants. The issue of slavery was the most difficult one faced by the framers, and it nearly destroyed the Union. Although some delegates believed slavery to be morally wrong, morality was not the issue that caused the framers to support or oppose the 3/5 compromise. Whatever they thought of the institution of slavery, most delegates from the northern states opposed counting slaves in the distribution of congressional seats because that would give them more votes to the southern states. So they agreed upon the 3/5 compromise, which is where the seats in the House were apportioned by population, according to which 5 slaves would count as 3 free persons. And the southern delegates insisted that the northern delegates should agree to bargain on this issue in order to reach the 3/5 compromise. James Madison was a key player in getting the Constitution written. He was a tireless negotiator and politician and relied on the writings of Montesquieu to propose a governing system that would protect liberty by preventing the concentration of power. The Constitution that was signed in Philadelphia in 1787 was a product of bargaining and compromise. Although the delegates to the convention did not agree on all of the features of the new government, in the end most felt that it was important to establish a more effective government than they had under the Articles of Confederation. The founders deliberately designed a system with limited popular control because they feared too much democracy would lead to poor government and to mob rule. However, they left enough power in the hands of the people to avoid the resemblance of a monarchy. The framers wanted a new government that would be strong enough to promote commerce and protect property from action by radical state legislatures. This became the constitutional basis for national control over commerce and finance, and for the establishment of national judicial supremacy and a strong presidency. The Constitution provides for separation of powers, where each of the 3 branches is independent of the others with distinct powers, and checks and balances, where all 3 branches must work together, thereby limiting the power of each other. Other constitutional features follow the ideas of John Locke: popular sovereignty, which is ruled by the people based on the consent of the governed, and limited government, which provides specific restrictions on what government may do. Federal power, like I said, is divided between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. You can see in this graphic how the executive branch represents the entire nation, while the House represents small districts and the Senate represents all of the states, and the judiciary represents the Constitution. So in Article 1, the Constitution provided for a Congress consisting of two chambers, the House and the Senate. Article 1 is also the longest article in the Constitution. The House and Senate have different term limits, 2 years in the House and 6 years in the Senate. The Senate was designed to guard against excessive democracy. The Senate alone has given the power to ratify treaties and approve presidential appointments, and the House is given the sole power to originate revenue bills. Section 8 of Article 1 lists the powers of Congress. Congress has the authority to collect taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce, declare war, and maintain an army and a navy. Article 1 also discusses express powers and implied powers. Express powers are specific powers granted by the Constitution to the Congress and the President. Implied powers are also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause or the Elastic Clause of the Constitution. This gives Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper to carry out their enumerated powers. The Constitution provided for the establishment of the presidency in Article 2. The President can negotiate treaties with the approval of the Senate, receive ambassadors from other countries, grant reprieves and pardons, appoint major departmental personnel, and veto congressional enactments. And Article 3 talks about the judicial branch. The judicial branch includes the Supreme Court of the United States, which has the power to resolve conflicts between federal and state laws. Judges are given lifetime appointments, and the Supreme Court has also assumed the power of judicial review, which is the power to declare laws unconstitutional. The Supreme Court is the final interpreter of the Constitution, but this is not a power granted by the Constitution. The Constitution only mentions the Supreme Court. All lower courts are the creations of the Congress, and we'll cover those later. Only the Supreme Court is protected against Congress through life terms for the justices, and the justices' salaries cannot be touched by Congress when they get angry about something that they do. This graphic illustrates that despite the massive powers that Congress has under the Constitution, it can still be quite difficult to pass major legislation. The three branches of government, all chosen by different mechanisms, with different constituency sizes and different term lengths, must coordinate to be able to act collectively. No one branch can conduct its core business without the approval or agreement of the other branches. The framers wanted to be sure that the government they created did not pose a threat to its citizens' liberties or property rights. And no principle of politics was more widely shared at the time of the founding than the principle that power must be used to balance power. And the founders were very careful to make sure that no branch had too much power. You can see from this graphic how overlapping powers lead to checks and balances between the branches. These checks and balances ensure that each branch has its own powers, but also some power over the others. The President can veto the acts of Congress. The Senate must approve presidential appointments to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can rule acts of Congress unconstitutional, and Congress can override a veto of the President if they can get enough votes. Once the delegates to the Constitutional Convention agreed to a constitution, it had to be ratified by the state conventions of each of the 13 states. The struggle for ratification was carried out in 13 separate campaigns. There were two sides, the Federalists and the Antifederalists. The Federalists favored a stronger central government, while the Anti-Federalists favored strong state government and a weak national government. Supporters of both sides wrote arguments that were published in pamphlets and newspaper editorials throughout the colonies. During the struggle over ratification of the Constitution, Americans argued about great political principles, like how much power should the national government actually have. They only needed 9 states to ratify, but eventually all 13 did. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists disagreed over 3 fundamental issues. Representation. Did the representatives need to be precisely like those they represented? Tyranny. Was the threat of tyranny in a gradual shift to aristocracy or from the majority? And government power. Should the national government have strict limits or broad powers? The Federalist Papers, written under the name Publius, were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They supported ratification of the Constitution. The Federalist Papers are the 85 most famous of these essays, written between 1787 and 1788. They were published in New York and several other states, urging ratification. They defended the Constitution and sought to dispel fears of strong national government. and they are considered to be one of the most important contributions to political thought made in America. They made powerful arguments as to why the new Constitution created a government that was strong enough to act, but controlled enough to not be tyrannical. And they are considered to be very practical because they defend laws and politics and the machinery of government. But they're also considered to be philosophical because they use words like reason, human nature, duty, good, passion, and interest. In paper number 51, they refer to justice as one of the ends of government and society, but they don't define justice. In number 62, they say good government will accomplish the object of government, which is the happiness of the people, but they make little effort to say what the term good government means. The Federalist Papers and the Federal Farmer, which was the Anti-Federalist propaganda, these both served as political propaganda to convince citizens to favor ratification, and may serve today as a record of the reasoning behind many of the elements of our Constitution. The Anti-Federalists wrote as Cato and the Federal Farmer. Patrick Henry and George Mason wrote against ratification. They were the Anti-Federalists and not exactly a unified group. They were not as well organized as the Federalists. One group opposed the Constitution because they thought stronger government threatened the sovereignty of the states. Other Anti-Federalists argued that a new centralized government would have all the characteristics of Great Britain that they had fought so hard to remove themselves from. Still others feared that the new government threatened their personal liberties. George Mason, in particular, felt that the Constitution was an insidious design to deprive us of our liberties. They wrote under the pseudonyms of Brutus, Sentinel, and the Federal Farmer. And although their efforts to stop the ratification of the Constitution were unsuccessful, their efforts were responsible for the creation and implementation of the Bill of Rights. So the Anti-Federalists, their writings led to the Bill of Rights. And the fears that the new government would be repressive led the Constitution's supporters to embrace the Bill of Rights as amendments to the Constitution, which helped to win ratification in a number of states. This graphic gives you a good visual of the differences between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Like, who were they? Federalists were property owners, creditors, and merchants. Anti-Federalists were small farmers, frontiersmen, debtors, shopkeepers, and some state government officials. And if you remember from back at the beginning, before the Declaration of Independence, these two groups were against each other then. They only joined together when they were fighting against Great Britain. And then you can see that what the Federalists believed were that elites were most fit to govern and they feared excessive democracy, and the Anti-Federalists believed the government should be closer to the people, and they feared concentration of power in the hands of the elites. The Bill of Rights was like I said, was one of the biggest points of contention during the ratification debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists did not think the Bill of Rights was necessary because there's nothing in the Constitution that expressly says the government can take away those rights. The Anti-Federalists thought that it was necessary because if the rights were not explicitly protected, citizens could be pressured into giving them away. And they wanted the Bill of Rights to protect the minority against the majority of the people. The inclusion of the Bill of Rights was a political compromise to ensure ratification, and it was a concession made by the Federalists during the ratification for debate. And as you know, the Bill of Rights provide for protections such as free speech, the right to counsel, and rights for those people that are charged with a crime. So the Constitution established procedures for its own revision in Article 5. The framers made it very difficult to amend the Constitution. A constitutional amendment may be proposed by 2/3 of the House of Representatives and the Senate, or 2/3 of the state legislatures. This format has never happened. And a constitutional amendment must be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures or 3/4 of the states through ratifying conventions, and this has only happened once. The U.S. Constitution has been amended only 17 times since 1971. Why do you think it has been amended so seldom? Because each amendment largely enacts a set of rules and policies, allowing the government to make new rules over time in order to adapt as circumstances change. But it's very hard to amend. The rules for ratifying the Constitution were set forth in Article 7. Now, this goes back to actually ratifying the Constitution at the very beginning when they had the 9 states versus 9 out of the 13. they needed approval from 9 of the 13 states to be formally adopted. And like I said before, they eventually did get all 13. The U.S. Constitution was enacted in 1789, and it is the oldest constitution that is still in use anywhere in the world. So who would create a system like this? The authors of the Constitution created a new system of government that produced a new set of winners and losers from the system that was in place. The authors of the Constitution had to create a government strong enough to deal with social unrest that the Articles of Confederation could not address. They also had to address small state fears that they would be dominated by the new government by the large states. And they had to deal with the reality that slavery was central to the economy of southern states. They were also trying to avoid a government as strong as the one that a revolution had been fought to escape, and they wanted to prepare a document that would diminish the power of the states, and then bring that document to the states for actual ratification. Part of the reason the Constitution has survived for more than 2 centuries is that it is vague enough to accommodate new issues and new technologies, like the internet, air travel, etc. President Lincoln helped to expand the executive power with his actions during the Civil War. Most presidents have continued to interpret the commander-in-chief powers quite broadly. The founders likely did not anticipate the U.S. maintaining a large standing army, and thus they likely did not anticipate this expansion of presidential power. The meaning of the document evolves over time as society becomes more complex and changes over time. Some other countries do not even have a written constitution, like the UK, Israel, and New Zealand. Their constitutional construction is expressed in multiple documents or laws. And the constitutions of countries like Brazil and Portugal actually include political and social goals. Some countries' constitutions also include citizens' duties. The institutions set forth in our Constitution remain the most critical factors in shaping the nature of conflict and cooperation within the American political system. The Constitution itself has endured for more than 200 years because it has the ability to change, yet it is not too easy to change. Since 1789, more than 11,000 amendments have been formally offered. Only 29 have been formally proposed, and only 27 have been ratified. The Bill of Rights, plus 17 others. Most efforts to amend have failed because they were simply attempts to use the Constitution as an alternative to legislation for dealing directly with the public problem. Successful amendments are concerned with the structure of government. A Constitution ought to enable legislation and public policies to be enacted, but it should not determine what that legislation or those public policies ought to be. As the chapter states, the U.S. Constitution lays out the purpose of our government, which is to promote justice, to maintain peace at home, to defend the nation from foreign foes, to provide for the welfare of our citizens, and above all, to secure the blessings of liberty for all Americans. It also spells out a plan for achieving these objectives, including provisions for the exercise of legislative, executive, and judiciary powers, and a recipe for the division of powers among the federal government's branches and between the national and state governments. One of the most important things to remember throughout the semester is that public policy is always a product of political bargaining, and so was the Constitution. So the next time somebody says to you that compromise is a bad thing amongst elected officials, remind them that our Constitution was a product of political bargaining, and our country wouldn't be the way it is if we hadn't had founding fathers who were willing to compromise. And lastly, as we saw in this chapter, the Constitution reflects high principle as well as political self-interest and defines the relationship between American citizens and their government. And as we go through the rest of the semester, we'll talk about the institutions of our government and how they are based in the Constitution and how some of them aren't. This is the end of Chapter 2. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. And I hope everybody has a great week. Thanks.